Hello and welcome. My name is Jane Lute. I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to this panel this afternoon. I'm the former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and a member of the Atlantic Council's Board of Directors. We're doing something today that's a little different for the Atlantic Council. We're addressing, I think, the most urgent question facing not only the United States at home, but United States abroad. And that is, how do we fix our troubled democracy? We couldn't be more better served than with the panel that I have the privilege of handing things over to today. But maybe just a word of introduction. Several years ago at Aspen, I was on a panel with General Dave Petraeus, and we were asked at the end of that panel, what were the greatest threats facing the United States in the world at that moment? And to me, Dave went where one would sensibly have gone and pointed out the dangers posed by Russia and China, Iran, and some of the other challenges facing our country. But to me, the greatest challenge facing the United States was very clearly that we would lose faith in each other. And I said so. And that's what we are in danger of having happen today. And this panel is designed to address that question. I'd like to introduce our panelists. John Raidt, who's a non-resident senior fellow and author of the book, Politics, Inc. John has enormous experience in the foreign policy and domestic policy world, having served with Senator John McCain and others. His book is a compelling read about the structural inadequacies that we are facing and offering some remedies about how to overcome them. He'll be joined, I'm very pleased to say, and honored by Tom Kean, former governor of New Jersey, who is spent a lifetime in public service, deeply immersed in the domestic political issues facing our country, from education to the environment, to responding to the tragedy of 9/11. He, in fact, many will remember, co-chaired the 9/11 panel with Lee Hamilton. They'll be joined by Heather Hurlburt, a friend and colleague of many decades, who I have enormous respect for. She is the director of New Models of Policy Change at New America and has deep expertise, both in practice and in the analytic world. And this session will be moderated by John Farmer, the director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers. Again, we couldn't be more well-served than by the expertise represented on this panel. I want to thank you again all for joining us, and just remind participants joining us via Zoom to please use the question function that Zoom provides and to ask your questions as we proceed. So let me hand things over to John.
Thank you so much, Jane. Really appreciate it. And if somebody had told me, or frankly any of us 2 years ago, that the pandemic we're facing would take 1 million American lives and that we'd witness the ransacking of our nation's capital, we all would have been shocked, I'm sure, but at least I would have assumed that such existential events would have unified our country. And to the contrary, though, in fact, the opposite has happened. We're more divided than ever, by all indications. So we're here today to ask why, to explore what this reality means for the future of democracy at home and the ramifications of these divisions for our place in the world. Governor Kean, I want to start with you. Because you came of age politically during a time of great polarization and division in the country. You were elected to the General Assembly, I believe, in 1968, which is one of those traumatic years in our history. And you served throughout the 70s through the Watergate scandal and the runaway inflation that occurred then. And then in the 80s served as governor of New Jersey, one of the toughest states, I think, in the nation to govern. And you were one of the more powerful governors, and you were able to govern in a bipartisan manner, even in the wake of all of that division. You also wrote a best-selling book, The Politics of Inclusion, which I think should be reissued. It's a real guide to our times today. But I guess my question is, having lived through this and been the chair of the 9/11 Commission, how do you view our current predicament in light of your experience? Are things structurally worse in a way that are going to be difficult to address, or are there lessons learned from your career that might help us through this period?
Well, I think the things we can do, but yes, it's worse. There's no question about it. When I was governor, I worked very closely with members that had a Democratic legislature. We worked on things together, and we took joint credit, and we got things through together. And I think most people think one of the most successful governorships was bipartisan. And when I did a 9/11 commission, first thing I said to Lee Hamilton, who was my vice chair, and I love, by the way, people think he was co-chair. That's a credit to the commission, because the first thing I did to Lee was say, I'm not going to do anything without your participation. So first thing we did is make it bipartisan. And very few people have done that since. I didn't make a single decision on the commission regarding staff, regarding policy, regarding hearings, regarding anything, without getting Lee's agreement before I did it. And that's the kind of path we can use going forward if people are willing to do it. I talked to a member of Congress the other day in the Senate who said when she was in the Senate, the leaders of the Senate in both parties met together 2 to 3 times a week. And she said, you know what? They haven't met yet this year. I mean, that's where we are. And you know, you can blame it on the Congress, you can blame it on the press, you can blame it on the media, all sorts of things. But we're in a very bad place. I think there are solutions, but we've got to care about it enough to recommend those solutions and try to implement them one by one.
Thank you. Dr. Hurlburt, a similar question to you. You came to the White House at a time when the U.S. Was widely viewed as a model for other nations to emulate in terms of its governmental structure and our cultural values in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union. What role do you think our polarization has played in the changing reality that now very few nations you see out there openly emulating our politics, and others who used to, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, are actually going the other direction?
Thanks. And thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be reminded that I first got to know Jane Hull-Lute when working on a volume of essays about political violence and conflict resolution in their societies. I'm guessing I speak for her as well as myself that when we were doing that work, it was just unimaginable that we would be thinking about applying those lessons to ourselves. And yet, 20 plus years later, that's what I spend a significant amount of my time doing. And, you know, I am sorry to say, John, that I think the situation we're in is even worse than what you describe, in that you now actively see foreign leaders and foreign publics, both in our closest allies and in our most enduring foes, looking at the United States and saying, this is not a country that can lead, this is not a country that can keep its promises, and this is not a country that can be in the world the things that the US has been able to present itself as being. The example that I find the most stunning is on the anniversary this year of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, you actually had a debate in the opinion pages of Canadian newspapers. What should Canada do if the US becomes an autocracy, if democracy falls in the US, now that the border between the US and Canada, as I'm sure Atlantic Council audiences know, is the world's longest unsecured border. It's one of the great triumphs of both American democracy and American foreign policy, and that you have Canada saying, what are we going to do? How are we going to sustain our democracy without the US? I was lucky enough to travel in Europe for the first time a couple of years in November, and the question we were constantly asked was, what is your word worth as an American? And so, you know, this is not the most fundamental reason to care about the crisis in our democracy. The most fundamental one is the one that Governor Kean said. It's the loss of our ability to live our lives and control our destiny as Americans. But if that hasn't convinced you yet, the collapse in our ability to do things internationally should convince
you. And John Raidt, you begin your excellent new book, Politics, Inc., and I will eventually hold up a copy of it so that the audience can see what it looks like, with a chapter called The System is Blinking Red, which is a reference to a statement of George Tenet prior to 9/11, the summer of 2001, warning of an imminent al-Qaeda attack. Why do you liken our current situation to that quote, and what prompted you to write the book?
Well, first of all, let me thank the Atlantic Council and my fellow panelists, particularly Governor Kean, for taking his time, and Heather and John Farmer. I think I'd like to dovetail off what Heather said, is that political division and the dysfunction it breeds is a national security issue, which is why the original work that was conducted with the Atlantic Council in a paper, this was the proper home for it, because none of the great ideas the Atlanta Council has, or any ideas that are hatched around the country by elected officials, NGOs, and others, have a chance unless we can fix what I think are systemic flaws in our democracy. And John, what inspired me, I think, to write this, it was a long time coming. These are all reflection of long-standing trends that have reached critical mass. I think the magnitude and intensity today of problems that have always challenged democracy, but are accelerated by technological, cultural, and social dynamics. Things like, as Governor Kean pointed to, the influence of money in elective politics, which is now through the roof. Media bias, which could not be more intense. Negative partisanship and hyper-partisanship, again, has never been this high. And these are all demonstrable. This isn't just kind of recency bias. The trends are there in the slopes of graphs showing that this is a year-over-year, election-over-election phenomenon. So I reject the notion that somehow this is an ad hominem or episodic problem. This is a systemic problem. And again, I go back to, which hopefully we can talk a little about, the role of technology, the role of some cultural factors, and really our time in this continuing transition to the digital economy. And a lot of what we're going through does bear resemblance to what we went through in the late 19th century and 20th century, where fear, uncertainty, really affected the population, and that affected things like yellow journalism, propagandistic politics, and some of the other problems that we're seeing now.
So, John, similar question to what I've asked the other panelists in terms of your career. You, for a long time, were legislative campaign director for Senator McCain. And at what point during your career did these trends that you've identified start to take on a critical mass? When did you notice a change?
So I was his legislative director, not campaign director, but I'd say 5 factors jump out at me. First of all, the marginalization of the rational center, which has always been the construction zone of functional democracy. Centrists and statesmen are disappearing. And again, these are, for what I regard as systemic reasons, not just philosophical differences. 2 is a big change in political calculus of how to win elections. It used to be you won election by getting the center. Now it's about out inflaming your base, out demonizing the opposition. And of course, this is fanning hyperpartisanship and many of the ills that we're trying to come to grips with. And 3rd is the ballooning industry of politics, what I call, from the book Politics Inc., and with which I believe division is its business model. And I would say public dysfunction as its byproduct. Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. I think we've got a political industrial complex that is creating some of the same harms he warned of. And then 4th, and this is more the causal, it's the conversion of disagreement into hatred. It's better for fundraising, it's better for vote getting, but it's tearing us apart. And then lastly, I'd point to the steady disappearance of really fundamental disciplines, practices, norms, and virtues that are essential to healthy democracy. And again, we can get into some of those because I think they're really important.
Thank you. And Governor Kean, you had referred to your experience leading the 9/11 Commission in a bipartisan manner. And I remember having served with both you and John on that commission, that at the time it was hailed as a potential model for resolving issues in a bipartisan way going forward. But in retrospect, it almost appears as if it was an anomaly. So my question is, do you see a future for efforts such as the 9/11 Commission to sort of build bridges across partisan divides, or do you see it as a sort of a relic of a bygone era?
I certainly hope it's not a relic of a bygone era, because if Congress doesn't work, and Congress doesn't work right now, then you've got to have some other mechanism for solving the big problems and looking at them and coming out with solutions, not partisan solutions, but bipartisan solutions for the benefit of the American people. And if you tell me, and people have told me, that it's impossible now to establish a 9/11 Commission that is going to be bipartisan because of the divisions in the country, then what are we going to do? What are we going to do to find out about how to prevent the next COVID. What are we going to do about some of these problems that are really eating at the heart of democracy? How are we going to get solutions if the Congress can't work it and you can't either set up a bipartisan commission? I want to go back to one thing that's fundamental, people don't talk about too much, but Jefferson said very early on in democracy, it doesn't work without an educated populace. And if you go into the various interviews people do from time to time just on the street, and you find out the average person can't name the three branches of government or doesn't understand the difference between a republic and a democracy, or all the other things that are so fundamental to understanding and voting. If you take that ignorance and the lack of civics now in the schools, and the fact we're not teaching democracy, if you take that and combine it with this tremendous media change, where the internet and everything else is we haven't got Walter Cronkite anymore. We used to believe Walter Cronkite, and everybody united behind things. He was a sort of center when he switched in the Vietnam War. Most of the country switched. Unless we can start with an educated citizenry, then these demagogues from the right or the left are going to continue to prosper, and these internets to the right and the left are going to continue to prosper. And so I think, very fundamentally, as Jefferson knew, perhaps we ought to start and look again at the schools and whether or not we can really teach people what democracy is and why it's valuable.
Thank you. I know, John, that's one of the recommendations in your book is a re-emphasis on civic education and on public awareness. And Dr. Hurlburt, I spent much of 2015 on sabbatical, and I was in Paris that year. And while there, I began reading the English language newspapers published by China and Russia. And with their unremitting assault on our form of government and on our ideals, and that we now know is supplemented by social media intrusion into our very politics. And it struck me how, to the point of public ignorance, how little regard the American public has paid over the years to how we are viewed by the rest of the world. There was really no response to that unremitting propaganda from anybody. In your experience, how much of our sort of myopia has contributed to the decline in regard for America around the world?
So, first, in the interest of absolutely scrupulous adherence to truth, I need to correct you, John. I do not actually have a PhD. I would never want to have.
Well, you certainly deserve one.
Part of the Washington culture of dishonesty. I just needed to say that up top. It's a really interesting thing thinking back over the sweep of the careers of people in this call, because in fact, of course, disinformation and efforts to smear the image of the U.S. are nothing new. And, for better or for worse, all of us in this conversation are old enough to remember when I got to the State Department at the end of the Cold War as a young person, I was amazed to discover that there was a full-time employee of the State Department whose entire job it was to combat Soviet propaganda about Americans supposedly buying babies for parts in Latin America. So it's not the case that this is something new, nor, frankly, is it the case that the problem is that the U.S. has been indifferent to countering it. I mean, I would argue instead that the problem is that anything Moscow or Beijing can dream up, our own conspiracy industry has dreamed up something crazier. And now, all Moscow or anyone else has to do is just retweet and amplify us. And you see that happening. I mean, just to use one example, I saw recently some really alarming evidence of Russian bot farms fanning secessionist sentiment in the South. And, that's an enormous problem. I also think it's just interesting, since you mentioned France, France also has a terrible problem with extremist politics. And really, back in 2015, which we little suspected was the good old days, we could look across the ocean and say, well, thank God we don't have anything like parties in France. And on the one hand, the French political system looks like it's working better because so far those parties have been kept out of executive power in France. But good Lord, the decline of mainstream parties in France, it leaves one. It's just an interesting thing to contemplate, thinking about the factors, John Raidt, that you ticked off, is that in actual fact, many of our fellow democracies have all of these same problems. to one degree or another, which I find somewhat comforting and somewhat deeply disturbing, because it suggests, as deeply ingrained as our own problems are, there's something bigger at work.
Yeah, John Raidt, let's get to some of those the bigger issues that you identify in your book. Your book really sets forth.
John, but before you get to sorry for the interruption,
Yeah.
I just want to dovetail off something that Heather just said. So in the book, there's a discussion of the military chief of staff in Russia gave a speech to some of their planners and kind of a think tank, and unveiled their thought of what they called hybrid warfare or controlled chaos, active measures. Those are the names they have. And it was basically the idea of fostering the balkanization in the United States, that as part of their toolkit. And I think the big issue, as Washington warned, that internal factions were the best way to become vulnerable to what is an age-old effort of other countries to destabilize their adversaries. And that's the danger. But let's be very specific that this is a concerted effort, and not just by Russians, but we've seen it with other countries as well, and their capabilities are getting better, and we are creating the internal vulnerabilities to make it more likely that they can make headway.
So let's transition to how to address the structural issues that we've all identified. Governor Kean pointed to one really important way to do it, which is to reemphasize civics education, which has its own challenges, because that again becomes an ideological battleground in some quarters. But John, you talk about and you identify in the book a mercenary campaign and election industry that exploits technological forces like social media forces, in which journalists are paid by the click and not necessarily by the story or the word. A legal environment in which spending equals protected speech, and the need that causes policy organizations to raise money by stressing the urgency of issues that may not be urgent, and further drives polarization. I guess my question is, can this really be effectively addressed without dismantling this mercenary campaign election industry that you've identified?
Well, I think the path reform includes that. And again, in the interest of giving fives, I think 5 things are most critical. One is restoring the sensible center. What are the systemic solutions? Gerrymandering is a significant problem. Red states are getting redder, blue states are getting bluer. We're sending to Congress more members who are uninterested in compromise because it's too risky, and that has cascading effects. This is why it's hard to get governing coalitions of people together, because of this change in the calculus of how you get elected. I have to chuckle a little bit. There's a problem solvers caucus in Congress, and I think it's 50 some odd members at the last count, maybe more now. And when you look at the districts they come from, very narrow difference between the number of Republicans and number of Democrats. That tells you something. We're on the other side, because there's so much of a difference in widening. Landslides are growing and growing. The difference between registration in districts are growing and growing, and that suits both parties. I look at the book and talk about the fact that when we had Democratic legislators predominantly, Ronald Reagan spoke out against gerrymandering. Now that Republicans control so many, President Obama struck out. Doesn't that tell us something? That is a systemic issue, not a partisan issue. Things like open primary elections. Most people, I think 80% of the public would like open primary elections. So our choices on the ballot aren't dictated by a narrow fringe of each party. I believe in electoral college reform, and probably not what some people are thinking, just go to a total vote. I think we should prorate electoral votes. No Republican has to go to California because Democrats are going to take all the electoral votes. No Democrat needs to go to Texas for the same reason. I think it'd be better for our system if our candidates had to compete everywhere. I think it would have a moderating effect. The second is to break the party duopoly, expand ballot access, go for things like fusion voting and ranked choice voting. I think it scratches your head when politicians win with the plurality and then announce that they have a mandate to ignore the other side and do what they say. I just think the country needs to reject that and look for true majorities. Third, I think we need a Goldwater Nichols for government. It was something that Governor Kean talked about early on. We should institutionalize greater teamwork. We did this with the military because they were operating in their service stovepipes and not doing their best for national missions. Same thing with our civilian government. And there are things you can do without violating the separation of powers. Fourth is right the role of money. When you hear congressmen say that 40% of their time is spent dialing for dollars, taking time away from the other critical things they have to do to learn complex issues, work with their colleagues, learn what their constituents want. This is why you have to really propagandize, I guess was probably the only word, because that's the only way you can raise the money, create differences and distinctions. And then lastly, going back to this national campaign on civics literacy, get them in curriculum in every school, and the whole role of content in a democracy, to be able to trust facts, gets into the media section, which we hopefully will have time to cover.
Governor Kean, John listed several issues that are state-oriented in nature, like the redistricting process, and in New Jersey we have a system where we have equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans with a chairperson who's in effect a tiebreaker, and actually just recently, last week, that resulted in a bipartisan legislative map, which I thought was extremely unlikely. But Governor, the states have historically been viewed as laboratories of democracy. And John also mentioned issues like ranked choice voting and other kinds of reforms that will make districts more competitive and drive them to the center. What's your assessment of reforms like that and the role the states can play in perhaps lessening some of the polarization?
Well, states, as always, can play a great role and set the example. But the problem is the public interest is very different than the legislator's interest. The legislative interest want less and less competitive districts. Yeah. The public wants more and more competitive districts. And when that conflict happens, who wins? We got less competitive districts now than we've ever had. It seems to be every time we have redistricting, there's less competitive districts out there. So the result is a Congress, for instance, and state legislatures that are overwhelmingly one side or the other side, and we're running in districts where they don't have to worry about the general election, just the primary. When you just worry about the primary, you get further to the left, the Democratic Party, further to the right, the Republican Party, and then you end up with this parties at loggerheads, as you have right now. It's been a gradual process. We've gotten to the breaking point right now. We can't be much more partisan without really destroying the system. But let me say, I've always thought the cancer, both in state politics and national politics, was money. That seems to me the cancer on the system. It has been for a long time. Years ago, quite sensibly, the Congress passed a law that you couldn't spend more than a certain amount if you wanted to run for Congress. And you couldn't put a certain amount of, if you're rich, you wouldn't put a certain amount of your own money into the race. That was the law. Then we had something called Buckley versus Vallejo, which is a court case. And that basically said that money is speech. And court cases since have built on that. And so Thomas Jefferson would spin at his grave if he thought somebody said money was speech. It's a crazy idea, but now it's been codified into the law by our Supreme Court in both parties, from both parties. And so somehow we got to break that. Somehow we got to change that decision, get Congress to override or something, because I think as long as money is considered speech legally, we're never going to be able to reverse this trend of more and more money coming into these races at state level, at national level, and everything else.
Hey, John, can I hop in on that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
That and Citizen United gave birth to super PACs, which has been the single worst thing for our democracy to happen. And it's a great way for candidates and parties to offload and contract out the negative partisanship and negative commercials and ads that have gone up. And so that is a big part of the problem. And I would offer one solution to talk about. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but if you think that speech and money are synonymous, I don't think the forefathers had in mind that members of Congress or senators should be getting more money from outside of their districts and state than they do inside. And so many cases that is the case. So even trying to figure out a way to restrict finances to come from the people you represent, I think would have a great effect.
Also, I guess addressing the anonymity of some of these contributions, so you don't even know who's giving to some of those races.
Right.
That's outrageous. It really is.
So, Heather, and from the standpoint of someone who works at the nexus of our polarization and making international policy, what reforms do you think would greatly improve the prospects of developing a coherent international policy despite the polarization that exists in our country?
So I actually want to go back a little bit and sort of try to dig into some of the underpinnings of the symptoms that John Raidt ticked through, because I don't think it's an accident that Governor Kean started us off in this conversation by referring to 1968. Because I think, and it's also not an accident that many of the common sense solutions that you've just ticked off are things we've been trying and failing to do in our politics for a generation now. And, really the last 50 years, we've gone through a period where two things have happened. One is that our parties have sorted ideologically. It used to be the case that American parties were sort of the despair of political scientists because they didn't represent coherent groupings of interests. Now, I think you could argue that neither of the parties today represents a coherent ideology, but they certainly represent much more clear sorting than at any time in the past. And that is really one of the developments that underpins many of the developments, John, that you talk about. It also means that getting back to the center looks different because you're no longer, bipartisanship going forward isn't going to be about people who say, functionally the right wing of the Democratic Party overlaps the left wing of the Republican Party. No, functionally it's going to look like criminal justice reform, like where we've had successful bipartisanship around, say, the Violence Against Women Act or the US-Mexico trade agreement under President Trump, where you have some parties, some folks saying, it makes me a better conservative to pursue this, and others saying it makes me a better progressive to do this. So that's really a different style of bipartisanship. And so that's just the first thing I would note, that the way forward is not circling back to how it was before. The second point that I think Americans have got to take a deeper stock of is that split of the parties coincided with and was to some extent driven by, post 1968, both the emergence of groups of Americans who really hadn't had political power before and who, frankly, the Constitution was written assuming would not have political power, and other groups of Americans who saw the messy, loud, culturally alien fighting over us new folks, women included, having power, and said, ooh, that feels really uncomfortable and alien and anxiety provoking to me. Then you layer on top of that the economic developments of the last 50 years. And so we have this political sorting combined with a cultural sorting, which weaponizes our cultural differences and makes them just endlessly tempting targets for demagogues, so that we've now gotten to the point where members of the two political groupings, however much they might at the same time yearn for boring centrist politics, and also, as they tell pollsters, feel their very lives threatened by the adherence of the other party. And that's where we're into the situation that Jane Hall-Lute and I used to write about, where we are now talking about conflict prevention, resilience to political violence, not just how do we deal with polarization. I think that's the ugly reality that I think about a lot now, is basically how do we reestablish, never mind getting back to norms of a functioning Congress, getting back to norms that we solve our differences peacefully, that we don't espouse violence, that we don't try to change the results of elections, that we don't publicly embrace, the Holocaust or whatever it is. And so that, to me, frankly, is the first step that we now have got to try to deal with.
So Heather, how much of that sorting that you referred to is primarily driven by the money issues that Governor Kean and John identified, and can that sorting be addressed without addressing the underlying financing motivations that drive it?
I would would actually say it's exactly the opposite. We see the sorting starting to happen, frankly, in the 60s, driven largely by the Solid South strategy. And then we see a cultural reaction to that again, and you see the growth of both legitimate fear and also, frankly, overreaction and anxiety. And then we see, John, the political actors you talk about saying, oh, look, this using this kind of fear is electorally effective. And then, fear is a great tool for raising money. So, to me, the cultural shifts come first, and then the money reinforces the cultural shifts, which reinforce the money, and you're locked into something which, on my bad days, feels like a bit of a death spiral.
So John Raidt, what would your reaction be to Heather's point about the sorting and it really being culturally driven and money exacerbates something that's
let me say, look, democracy is meant to be partisan and our debates should be fierce, but the system must be fair and functional and it must be able to forge consensus or we lose in the 21st century on really big issues. And I think the thing that upsets me is that all these factors, legitimate and some propagandized, are making us lose sight of the foundational principles and the values that make democracy such an important cause. And I say in the book, I said, look, our principles were laid down in a sinful era, but the inability or the ignorance of practicing principles does not damn those principles. And if you went to any American, wherever they come from, and laid out what those core principles are of rule all the way down, people are going to say, yes, it's a matter of how we implement it. And I think the danger here is that all this other stuff is obscuring the glue that has always bound us together and always will if we focus on it.
Right. And before we turn to audience questions, I have a final question for all three of you, which is politics being the art of the possible. What are the single most important achievable reforms that you think that we can pursue to address the sorry state of our democracy? I'll start with Governor Kean.
Well, I started with education. I believe in education. I believe that's fundamental to the democracy, and the fact that I think if you look far left and far right, a lot of the things you hear are idiocy. But unless you're educated, you don't understand it's idiocy. You may believe it. And that's happening. So I'd say number one, that. Number two, I do believe money it just exacerbates every single problem we have. And number three, I think we've got to get to know each other as a people, and that whether you're in Congress and you're in the House and you only meet twice a week or 2 days a week, and therefore you never really, and that's partisans, you never really get to know other members, even if you've been there 6 years together, you don't know each other. And similarly in our neighborhoods and our families and everything else, we got to get back to getting to know each other. And because once you get to know each other, it's hard to hate somebody you know well. And that, whether it's a legislative body or a family, in my extent, it's getting to know people you can work. If you find out you're going to work with them, the motivation is the same. People, Democrats, Republicans, really want to do good, and that's why they ran for office.
Thank you, Heather. What would you say?
So I'd actually start where Governor Kean ended and put a finer point on it, that we actually know strategies that do work in cities and communities to help build cross-cutting identities so that people have senses of themselves as New Jerseyans or Marylanders. And the two examples that are sad ones that I always like to cite are the city of Boston after the Marathon bombing and the city of Orlando after the Pulse nightclub shooting, where you had mayors and local religious groups that had really gone out of their way to get to know groups that were very different from them. So you had communication between Christians and Muslims and between city government and Muslims in Boston that defused a very tense situation, culminating, and I always have to mention this because I'm a proud Red Sox fan, with Ortiz going out on the field at Fenway and saying that he was a proud Bostonian and no one could take the city away from them. And for a city with the history of racial and cultural discomfort and polarization that Boston has, that's a moment that we could all learn something from in our own communities. And Orlando after the nightclub shooting, another example. So building ties in our own communities that say violence is wrong and we refuse to dehumanize each other. And because it's that coming from that level up that makes it safe for our leaders to do that at the national level, as we've unfortunately seen that it's become much safer in a political context to pursue the extreme. I also just have to say on education, and maybe this is a result of having a child currently in Maryland public schools, but I think it's so interesting that we keep coming back to the role of education and civics, which is of course a state issue. And it might be worth remembering that we had, 30 or 40 years of attempts to defund and diminish the federal role in education. So, maybe that's a lesson about how we think about and how we frame the role of government. And, if that's not coming back to bite us in a rather significant way.
And I also think civics is now an adult education issue too, given the level of sheer adult ignorance of basic civics. And so, John, before I let you answer, I have to hold up your tome here so that the audience can see what it looks like. But again, what are the few achievable things you think that we can do and pursue to address this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think those 5 things that I mentioned are doable. I think we need a civilian movement in a democracy. It said people get what they deserve. And I think a lot of people are feeling very undeserving of the government and the politics we have right now. And we really need a critical mass of people to demand the change and the systemic reforms that were required from civics education on up into the other systemic problems that I think both parties have given us.
Would you endorse universal service as some kind of requirement as part of that mix?
Yeah, I think as I said in the book, I think national service, we had a commission on national service, that a good bipartisan commission came out with a lot of great ideas. And I think those should be adopted. We can't, Congress offs its duty sometimes and in panels groups. 9/11 Commission enjoyed great success. Not all of them enjoy that same level of success. And that's one of them that we really need to look at their recommendations.
Okay, we're a little bit behind, but I want to turn it over now to Chris for audience questions, Q&A.
Great, thank you, John. That was a terrific discussion, and now we have a chance to hear from some of you. I've been watching the questions coming in through the Q&A, and several of them really have sort of revolve around, is our current system based on the Constitution up to the task? Harlan Ullman points to, the Constitution is based on checks and balances. Do these checks and balances work in an era when you have veto-proof majorities in the Senate, for example? But I also am thinking about this from the perspective, and John, you teed this up. Are there incremental changes that can be made even at the state and local level without discarding the Constitution or making major changes to the Constitution, which, for all its faults, has somehow managed to survive for all these years? So I guess I'll put that to John Raidt first, but I'd love to hear as well from Heather and Governor Kean.
Well, of course, some of it might be constituted. We've changed it 27 times, so I don't think we rule that out. Times change, needs change, and so I wouldn't rule that out. But I think it goes back to something that Governor Kean said very early. Why in the world don't we have joint planning between Republicans and Democrats at the beginning of a Congress of here's our agenda, and here are the principles that are gonna govern that, and then the public has something to hold them accountable to. When are we going to get back to the regular order so people that are duly elected members can actually go down and represent their constituents by offering amendments and voting on them? I had a prominent senator told me once leadership is taken back the regular order and writes the big bills and plops down a 1,000-page bill on your desk, and you really don't have the opportunity to amend it, what's left but partisanship? And again, why is it that it's such an extraordinary thing when the President of the United States meets with the leaders of Congress? I believe in the separation of powers, but there is a certain level of teamwork that has got to be achieved in a functional democracy.
Heather or Governor Kean, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I added one thing. I think the idea of checks and balances is absolutely vital. And we got to be very careful when we start tinkering with that, because the founders were historians. I mean, they really had examined the democracies in Greece and the Republic in Rome, and they understood that democracies generally didn't last more than 1 or 2 generations, ever in history. And why was that? Because pure democracies cannot work. They tend to either oligarchies or sometimes just dictatorships. And so they put in checks and balances to stop the excesses of what they saw democracies in the past. So before we need those checks and balances. We want to get rid of them because we want to do something. We get rid of that check or that balance, and we can do that right away. It's not going to work in the overall system. And one more fun thing, just the other thing is, I had lunch a year or so ago, and I guess 3 or 4 years ago now, with Fritz Mondale. And he was talking about his experience in the Senate. And he said, I don't understand how the Senate ever works now. Because he said, whenever we had a problem, and we had a lot of big problems, whenever we had a problem, we went to a group in the Senate who was about 20 of them in those days. And they were a group of either what we call Rockefeller Republicans or Blue Dog Democrats. And we went to them, and around those people, we solved every problem. He said, that's a great book. It's never been written. He said that was how the government worked for a long, long time. That center has disappeared. So I think ways in which we reestablish the center should be a topic of discussion also.
Chris, I'll in also, I could name off, and I'm sure despite the governor's wonderful encomium to the Constitution, I'm sure all of us could name off 2 or 3 things that we would make a little different if we could wave a magic wand and make it different. But every time I start to get tempted into thinking about going down that road, I think about, some of our great fellow democracies, right? The UK, which has no written constitution whatsoever. France, which has had more constitutions than I can count. Israel, which has a very strange situation. And, as I said earlier, none of the, some of those democracies are functioning better than we in some ways. Some of them are functioning as badly or worse in important ways. So as much as, and I have some brilliant colleagues at New America who think a lot about the structural side of things. But, at the end of the day, I strongly suspect that we're going to have to muddle along with what we've got and tinkering. And then just to invoke that wonderful cliche, any constitutional change you do want to make, I think, is going to have to come through seeing it work effectively at state level.
Right. That brings up another question we got from Alec Evans about sort of, you look at these different systems of government around the world, democracies, they are quite different. And I think, to Governor Kean's point, there is a tension between the checks and balances of the US system versus a parliamentary democracy, which by its nature is more inclined to get things done because you've sort of built into the system a majoritarian impulse. And of course, the federal system also is unique to the United States. I wonder if there were some reforms that have been hinted at, and I'd love to get you all on record or just sort of your thoughts on this. Things like, we've talked about gerrymandering and the use of sort of drawing congressional boundaries in a nonpartisan way. John, you talk about that in your book. Ranked choice voting, proportional representation. If there were one sort of incremental change that would not require a change of the Constitution, and even some of these things have been implemented at state level, which one sort of small reform would you point to as your first choice? I guess I'll start with John. Go ahead, John.
Boy, I'm going to have to think about that. Because it's again, the problems are systemic, and I don't see any one silver bullet that's gonna change everything. I think something like restoring the sensible center is a whole basket of things. Is it tough work? Yes. But the stakes are so high, I think we've got to be willing to say it's tough work and to do it. People say, well, that's naive or pie in the sky or impossible, but what's the alternative?
Right. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? I've got a few
Chris-
other questions in the loop. Go
Chris,
ahead,
I'll
Heather.
be provocative and say that we seem to be moving backward away from our commitment to the idea that every American citizen can vote. And so if I were going to make one tweak that I think then ideally makes other changes possible, it is absolutely ensuring that every American citizen is able to cast a ballot and have their ballot counted.
Well said. Thank you. I have a question, and there's a new question from the audience. Hua Ahmed points to, and this is where we sort of tie back to the themes about how this relates to U.S. foreign policy, because we've seen the Biden administration put an enormous emphasis on the importance of democracy. They convened the Summit of Democracies late last year, and we've seen efforts to do this, and everywhere from Iraq to Afghanistan and all points in between. How would you all how would you interpret the United States' ability to promote democracy globally in light of the fact that we're having challenges here at home? Can these things work together? They move forward with the Summit for Democracy on the basis of the assumption that addressing these problems together as democracies could help us promote it at home. How do you all feel about that? I'll go to you first, Heather, on that one, because I'm sort of curious to hear what you have to say, and others if they want to weigh in.
For reasons that we talked about earlier in this conversation, the success of democracy at home is inextricably linked to the success of democracy abroad. We now have, as someone said earlier, people going to take lessons from Viktor Orban. You do have, oddly, for the particular faction of American autocrats who don't really much like internationalism, they're very internationalist in their own way. So I wholeheartedly support Biden's instinct that democracy here is interlinked with democracy there. And I think you see in Ukraine, you see in Myanmar, you see in South Sudan, despite the weakness of our democracy and its obvious flaws, there's still a demand for, you see democracy activists speaking up angry where the US hasn't spoken up in support of them. So our hypocrisy and failures don't move us off the screen entirely, and never have. But it's also the case that we are not able to marshal a grand coalition and sort of move out from a summit in the way that you might have used a summit in the past. And I think the Biden administration was hoping to have sort of a groundswell of energy come out of it, and I think maybe that has not produced quite the groundswell they'd hoped, and that certainly at home we're going to have to produce our own groundswell.
Right. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? I got a couple other questions in the queue.
I would just say I think the problem is we're tarnishing the image of democracy at home. The international comments following our presidential debates is all you really need to read. Right. Who's going to say, yeah, that's what we want? And I think a bellwether, when you look at the continent of Africa and the role that is going to play in the globe in this century, in terms of stability or not stability, you have a leader like Kagame in Rwanda, who said, we're no longer looking to the West or Western institutions for models. We're looking elsewhere. That is a huge statement. It's a canary in the coal mine that really needs to wake us up, because as American democracy goes, I think so the world goes.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with that more. And the model is China. That's what we're fighting. Whether or not that kind of government can increase people's welfare more than we can, right, is what's up for the world.
Right. We don't want that to be our model, right? So that's the competition.
That's right.
That's the competition.
That's it. That's the competition.
That's the competition. Time for a couple more questions before we wrap. I've been struck, and Harlan Ullman raised this in his question as well. You look at the way the United States came together after a great crisis like Pearl Harbor. Again, we have to remember American politics was extremely divisive back in the late 1930s. And yet, you have an incident like Pearl Harbor where people come together after 9/11. the United States came together. And yet after the COVID crisis, the opposite happened, arguably. There was not this uniting. And separately, I've been struck by, looking back on presidential approval ratings as it relates to foreign policy crisis. We used to talk about a rally around the flag effect, such that even foreign policy failures were often associated with the high point of a president's popularity. John Kennedy was his highest favorability rating was not after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but after the Bay of Pigs. So even setbacks caused a rally around the flag effect, and we just have not seen that in the last several presidencies where even arguable foreign policy successes have not contributed to rising presidential approval and a sense that the people have come together. Is this something we can recover, or is this, as Heather pointed out, I'm not trying to put her on the spot, but she said we can't really go back to that old model. We need to imagine a more sort of log rolling model. Are the days of rally around the flag effect gone, or can we imagine something coming along to change that?
I don't think they're going.
Governor Kean says that's a good one. He takes it first.
Who?
Governor Kean, did you say that? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think they're going, but they're in particular. For instance, if somebody would attack the United States in some way or other, we would rally around the flag. No question about it. I think we'd support President Biden, and it would be bipartisan, and we'd respond to those attacks. But these other questions are much more complex and much more difficult to contemplate. And a lot of people, frankly, I don't think fully understand the ramifications of a lot of these questions. And I want to go back to education, but I'm all for Heather. I want to give everybody the opportunity to vote, but I also want them to be educated. I don't want dumb votes, and we got a lot of that now based on what's coming over the internet and these crazy groups, the left and right, and so on. So where I started, but I think educating the American voter is probably one of the most important things we can do.
Thank you very much. I think that relates to a question we got from Greg Schuckman, who we've talked a lot about the structure of the system and the difficulty of making major reforms. But he asked, what can the average citizen do who generally doesn't have a platform or great wealth to help to start repair this damage? I've heard you all say education is so more important. Or you say to Greg, get out educated, and thanks for attending events like this, because this is a sign that you're trying to get educated. But on a more serious note, if you could speak to just an average person, not someone who is aspiring to higher office, what can they do to get us back on the path to reform? I'll start with John. I'd like to hear from all three of you, and then I'll close.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear John Farmer's thoughts on that too.
Yes, John Farmer as well, of course. Yes.
Go to your town halls, to your congressman. Tell them you're not going to put up with this anymore. Demand better. What are they doing to work with the other side to address problems? I think that's one of the things people do, and also looking at their own behavior. The problems in our chat rooms are as bad as they are in our political cable shows and on the floor of the House and the Senate. It's a chicken and egg. I think they reinforce one another. And so as we post or we take something that we'd like to believe because it tarnishes the other side and it's salacious and dramatic and conflictual, and we'd love that. And that's the basis of all good drama, and pass it along saying, look what these people are doing. Maybe take the time to check other sources and see if it's true. So we're a democracy. We get the government we deserve. So I think we have to see our own culpability in these issues.
Great. Thank you, John. John Farmer?
Well, I think we have to sort of cultivate institutions that will be bulwarks against the kind of partisanship that we're seeing. And a little advertisement for my own little Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers, but we like to see ourselves as an island of civility where all viewpoints are welcome and we engage with them at a fairly high level. And I think encouraging institutions around the country like that is a good first step.
Great, thank you. Heather or Governor Kean, would you like to weigh in, or go ahead, Heather?
Yeah, just to build on what's already been said, some specific things you can do in your community. Go out and support your local teachers and your local elections officials who are right now trying to do this kind of work under very difficult circumstances. What we didn't talk about the role of technology and social media in weaponizing this stuff, but for the love of God, think before you share. And in some way, in one part of your life, spend time with people who are really different from you.
Well said. Governor Kean?
I just want to echo what Heather just last point. Go out and find someone who doesn't agree with you and listen. Don't talk, listen. See what they have to say, and you're amazing what you can learn. And sometimes you might even change your mind.
I think that's a great place to wrap it up. I want to thank all of our panelists for today. Thank you for joining us. And I want to reiterate how important this discussion is of the need to repair and reform American democracy as it relates to the mission of the New American Engagement Initiative. We're housed within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council, and we here at NAEI believe that an effective and sustainable grand strategy must take account of the political situation here in the United States, hence the importance of this discussion. Our power must ultimately come from within, and we cannot look past these problems plaguing our domestic politics when we build our foreign policy. At NAEI, we scrutinize the assumptions underlying U.S. foreign policy. We question these assumptions in order to identify fresh, new concepts for how the United States can better advance its interests alongside its partners and allies. Yes, we identify problems, but never without also offering solutions. And our name is our mission. We are always on the lookout for new and productive forms of U.S. global engagement. And so this conversation today really featured many of the important ideas that can help us towards that goal. I'm so grateful to all the panelists, and a final shout out to John Raidt and his new book, Politics, Inc., America's Troubled Democracy and How to Fix It. Lastly, thank you all for tuning in today. We hope you will join us for future New American Engagement Initiative events, and keep an eye out for our upcoming work on immigration, diplomacy, security, and many of the other issues that we were discussing today. Have a nice day.